Alrighty, it is 5:01, so we'll go ahead and start. Maybe some more folks will pop in as we go, but thanks for sharing those recommendations in the chat. I know I've got some traveling to do to see some of those. So thanks so much for joining us this evening for this webinar about North Georgia's extraordinary biodiversity. We're excited to have you all here for this conversation. My name is Chelsea Corbin. I am the Major Gifts Manager for the Georgia chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and I will be sort of your MC for the evening. We will have a presentation for about half of our time tonight. We'll hear from 4 different conservation staffers, Eric Brown, Ann Flynn, Katie Owens, and Tyler Cross. And then we will have that question and answer session. We want this to be as meaningful to you as possible. So please let us know what we can cover that will mean the most to you. But before we get to that, I will introduce Nancy Claire McEnany, who is one of our trustees here at the Georgia chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and a really wonderful advocate for North Georgia in particular as a geography in our state. So Nancy Claire, thank you for hosting this webinar tonight, and I will turn it over to you.
Great. Can y'all hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up. Yep, okay, great. Well, thank y'all for being here. I know it's 5 o'clock. I'm sure y'all been on Zoom calls today and need to get off Zoom. So please, this is gonna be a fun, educational event. I hope it's inspiring to you. So please just enjoy and throw out questions you have. The slide that you see right there is are my boys, 2 boys, Nicholas and Will, and they're hiking in one of my favorite places. Can anyone, you can chat, put it in the chat thing of where that might be. Does anyone recognize where that is in North Georgia? Anyone? Well, it is at the edge of the world. It's Amiclola River. What we did was we hiked down and then we got in the river and started walking up the river. And if you can see, this is in July with really, heat of COVID. And there's so many people, I don't know if you can tell, but there's so many people enjoying that beautiful spot. It's edge of the world, the Amiclola Falls. It's a wilderness management area. And it's a wonderful place to take a mental health break. I love the Japanese expression of forest bathing that I think that we all do when we go up to the North Georgia mountains. We do forest bathing where your heart rate naturally goes down, your breathing rate goes down, and you just feel more relaxed. And the North Georgia mountains are a really special place to me. I got married in North Georgia. I remember when I got married, I had a friend from California say, "Wow, this is like Costa Rica." And I was like, God, that makes it sound so glamorous. I mean, wow, is this a destination wedding? So I had never been there. And then when I did travel to Costa Rica, I realized, wow, it is like Costa Rica. I mean, it is beautiful and lush, and it's really the biodiversity that makes it special. And so tonight, what you're going to hear from are TNC staff that will explain why the biodiversity is important in North Georgia, not just for Georgia, not for our clean water and clean air, but for the world. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Eric Brown. He's the Director of Land Stewardship, and he will be our first conservation speaker. So thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Nancy. Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening. So I wanted to spend the night just talking a little bit about why we're working in North Georgia, touch on how the Nature Conservancy is approaching it, and then let my colleagues really kind of dive into some specific examples without me going in too deep. So I was going to give a pretty big level overview, and then let Tyler, Ann, and Katie kind of go through some of the finer details. So looking at this slide, just trying to answer the question of why it is that we're working in North Georgia. This slide, to me, is kind of the epitome of why the Nature Conservancy is interested in North Georgia. The biodiversity of Georgia in the southeast just really pops out in here. You can see that the 2 columns that really interest me are total richness and endemics. And there's a row for mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, fish, and trees. And you can just see that the southeast just pops out like a Christmas tree. It's just really bright with the amount of diversity that we have. And I think some of you who have some keen eyes might kind of be keying into the fact that a lot of the diversity is showing up in the south part of our state, which is really tied to our longleaf pine habitats. What doesn't really get picked up at this scale is the fact that that longleaf pine actually comes into North Georgia, and Katie's going to be talking about that quite a bit. Our North Georgia mountains also have they have longleaf, but it also bleeds into the southern Appalachians and just the high amount of biodiversity in the Appalachian Mountains. Next slide, please. So one thing that longleaf doesn't have that North Georgia does is there's kind of two key areas where North Georgia blows away everybody else as far as biodiversity goes. And one is the number of salamanders that we have. It's not only important for the US, but it's a global hotspot. There is nowhere on the planet where we have the diversity of salamanders that we do in North Georgia and the mountains. Our friend Thomas Floyd with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources is there holding a hellbender, which is one of the largest species of salamander in the world. In the middle there is a pigeon mountain salamander named for where you can find it, and that's the only place you can find it in the world. And then on the right is the green salamander, which is just gorgeous. It blends into the rock and the lichens so well. And salamanders always intrigue me in the fact that they cross boundaries of being terrestrial and aquatic species, and they're a bellwether for the health of our forests and our waters as well. Next slide. So the other area where North Georgia kind of goes above and beyond its representation as far as biodiversity goes is freshwater fishes and mussels. Katie will talk a little bit more about this, but there's really nowhere else in the US and even in the world where we have such a diversity of aquatic life. And it's important to note that we're going to be spending most of the time tonight talking about our terrestrial systems, but there's a really strong link between the health of our terrestrial forests and water, not only in terms of water quality, but also in water quantity. We know that our healthy forests with native species tend to have water quality that is higher, as well as having more water in those streams. Next slide. And this is the water quantity issue is pretty important from a human standpoint too, and just trying to develop and recognize the importance of sustainability. So we know North Georgia is a drinking water source for over 10 million people. Each one of those black dots on that map, which spans the entire southern Appalachian region, is a source of drinking water. And so while not directly linked to biodiversity, it's a pretty important reason why we're working in North Georgia. Next slide. And last, but certainly not least, is recognizing the importance of North Georgia to connecting our landscapes from a climate adaptation standpoint. So I talked about the fact that we know we have a high level of biodiversity in our longleaf pine systems. That comes up into Northwest Georgia. And this flow map is really showing how Northwest Georgia is connecting to the Appalachians and is creating a corridor for a lot of these species to adapt to climate change and be able to move. Next slide, please. So this slide has a lot going on with it. And I'll start just by going back to that climate change flow and recognizing where you saw that large string of different species moving through that climate flow. It pretty much parallels exactly this area that we've got outlined. So the Nature Conservancy is taking a look at our southern Appalachian ecoregion in a holistic approach. We're working across state boundaries, working with 7 different states from Virginia to the Carolinas, Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. And we're working with different staff from all of those chapters to really kind of bring out the best of all those chapters and the different tools and try to apply things in a consistent manner. So what I would like to point out on this map is everything that you see kind of in the orange or the brown and the dark are these areas that we know are resilient landscapes, and they're fairly connected. Most of that is owned by the U.S. Forest Service, most but not all. And we talk about it being a resilient landscape from the perspective of climate change, recognizing that it's already protected. There's some sort of level of a fairly good habitat there. With the Southern Appalachians, it's incredibly important for climate change adaptation because of the very unique physiographic or physiological properties that allow it to provide refuge for species moving north. So we know with the changes in elevation, that's going to have a cooling effect, so species can move up and down in elevation. We know with the mountains, there are different sides to a mountain. So a north aspect is very different from a south aspect, and different species are able to take advantage of that. And then, of course, is just the fact that that mountain change runs along the entire eastern seaboard from the south to the north, allowing species to move across the landscape from Georgia all the way up into the boreal forests of Canada through some protected lands. So we recognize that we have this connected, resilient landscape. And by resilient, I'm saying, we understand that it can take some of the changes of that climate change is bringing to us and be able to adapt to that. So the Nature Conservancy has really looked at 5 different ways that we're going to approach our work across this entire landscape. 1 is building capacity. 2 is increasing the pace and scale of restoration. And those 2 things are largely tied to some of our partner work. So recognizing that most of those polygons that you see on that map are owned by the Forest Service or one of our partners, we know that those partners are not able to get all the work done that they want to get done. So when we talk about building capacity, we're trying to find ways to actually help our partners bring people, bring expertise to them so that they can get done what they want to get done. Same is true of increasing pace and scale, just recognizing it's not always about just people, it's also about some of the science and some of their abilities to kind of jump over some hurdles. And of course, we're providing science and leadership. We're making that forest-water connection that I've already talked about and identifying priorities. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail into kind of 2 approaches. Next slide. So that last slide was kind of showing us ecologically where we'd want to work. This slide is kind of showing where our opportunities are at and trying to make sure that we're building a connection from the south all the way to the north. So in that collaborative approach, all TNC chapters looked at those high priority areas and said, okay, well, this is great, but where can we actually find partners to help us with? And this is what that map is about. So those green polygons are where we know we have some opportunities with our partners that want to do some work, and recognizing that while not all of the green polygons are touching, we wanted to recognize and try to develop some sort of connection between those polygons. And the best way that we can do that is with our freshwater work. So those blue lines are showing the rivers that we know are critically important to our work. Next slide, please. So Tyler, Katie, and Ann are going to be talking a lot more about this, but I just kind of wanted to bring it back or highlight from a big scale of what we're looking at. So I shrunk the map here a little bit. This map is really just focused on the Southern Blue Ridge. Our recent work within the Nature Conservancy has expanded to include the entire Southern Appalachians. In this map, we've really shown, or through our science, have been able to identify those forest types that require fire. So even if we protect it, which most of it is protected under the U.S. Forest Service, we know we're not going to get the species that we want unless we manage it with fire. And so you can see even across the entire landscape, Georgia's lit up even more than any of our other states. We hold the bulk of the fire adapted forest within the Forest Service system. And so Tyler is going to be talking at length about our desire and our efforts to help the Forest Service actually bring fire capacity to them. Next slide. Another really important thing that we would like to focus on, which has a little bit of controversy associated with it, but I think it's undue controversy, and that is recognizing that we can increase the pace and scale by not relying just on fire, but actually engaging in some timber harvesting activities. So again, across the entire landscape of the Southern Blue Ridge, we looked at all the lands owned by the Forest Service that were in that should be some sort of fire maintained ecosystem. And all those ecosystems most of those ecosystems are showing some sort of level of degradation from a lack of fire. And one of the ways that we can restore those systems is not just through fire itself, but actually through some mechanical thinning. Some of those pictures on the right are some products of places where we've actually gone in, done some commercial timber harvesting, applied prescribed fire, and seen the results. And that's kind of what I got. So I was going to turn it over to Ann to really dive in a little bit more into some much greater detail on very specific projects that we're working on.
Great, thank you, Eric. So Eric mentioned both land protection and restoration, two conservation tools we're using across North Georgia. And I just want to focus in on one priority area where we're deeply engaged in both protection and restoration, and that's the dug down corridor. And you can see that here on this map in purple, kind of on the left half of the map. So the dug down corridor is a place where we're engaged in a multi-scape landscape scale protection effort with the goal of connecting the Sheffield-Paulding Wildlife Management Area in Georgia with the Talladega National Forest in Alabama. So this may be an area you're familiar with, and if you haven't been there, you're probably familiar with some with a few areas such as the I-20 corridor, which runs just south of the dug down, and also the Silver Comet Trail, which you can see on this map. It's kind of a dashed line. It runs along the north end of the corridor. So this is a place that's very easy drive from Atlanta. Really, the Sheffield-Paulding WMA is heavily used wildlife management area. There's significant demand for increased public lands, and it's also just a very high conservation priority. So this is the resiliency slide that Eric showed earlier with a star showing you approximately where the dug down corridor is. So you can see from this map that this is a really important area from a climate resiliency standpoint. So if species are trying to move to adapt to climate change, it's really critical that they have the opportunity to move through a protected dug down corridor. It's kind of the southern end of the Appalachian Mountains, and it provides opportunity for species to move farther north towards those large blocks of protected lands, especially the national forest lands. So that's one reason we're really interested in working in this area. And I'm going to hand it over to Katie to talk about some of the dug down's other conservation values, and then we'll circle back to the land protection work that we're doing there.
All right, thanks, Anne. So Eric and Anne have kind of covered the high level of some of the biodiversity in North Georgia. And what I'm going to do is really focus in on the dug down and tell you why it's so unique. So if you're looking at this slide, the map on the left is showing the aquatic biodiversity in the area. So you remember Eric's big picture slide where he said freshwater biodiversity is really just incredible across all of North Georgia, or really even in the southeast. This particular map shows the levels of biodiversity just within the freshwater system. So if you're looking at the map, you look at the purple outline, that shows the entire dug down corridor, and then the brighter red show the actual higher aquatic biodiversity in the area. And there's three things I want to point out with this map on the left. Within that dug down corridor, we're mainly in the Coosa watershed, but there's three important systems in this map. If you look on the far right, you'll see the green area is called Paulding Forest, Sheffield Wildlife Management Area that Anne mentioned. It's home to Raccoon Creek, and I'll get into that in just a little bit, but Raccoon Creek is a high biodiversity tributary of the Etowah watershed. And then if you move to the center of the purple of the dug down corridor, you'll see on the southern end the Tallapoosa River. So the Tallapoosa River is the southern anchor of our dug down corridor. And then if you go over to the western side, you'll see this dark blue Terrapin Creek that's in both Georgia and Alabama. So those three systems are incredibly unique freshwater systems, which I'll tell you a little bit of the species about in just a few minutes. But I just want you to take away from this map that the dug down in terms of aquatics has incredible biodiversity. Now, if you look at the slide on the right, what's really unique about the dug down to me is not only is it a phenomenal biodiversity location for freshwater, it's also home to montane longleaf. So I'll tell you guys about longleaf that aren't familiar with it, but the photo on the right shows some older longleaf pine trees, and the montane longleaf ecosystem is scattered throughout this entire dug down corridor. Next slide, Anne. Okay, so this map is really showing an aerial view of the dug down corridor. It's taken at Paulding Forest Wildlife Management Area, and it's looking west towards Alabama. And what's unique about this photo and the dug down corridor is we have two different physiographical regions that converge, the Ridge and Valley and the Piedmont. And whenever you have two different physiographical regions converge, it's usually when you see this incredible biodiversity, not just from a terrestrial standpoint, but also from an aquatic standpoint. Okay, so for those of you not familiar with longleaf, I'm just going to give you a quick history of the longleaf pine. So if you're looking at the map on the left, that shows the historic range of all of longleaf pine systems. So everything in that bright green there is where the longleaf pine would have been the dominant tree, the dominant ecosystem. Now, if you look at those red boxes, that's what we call montane longleaf, also known as mountain longleaf. So we're really focusing in on the mountain longleaf today, what's in those red boxes. And you actually see one larger red box and one smaller red box. And we're going to specifically focus on the northern red box, which is part of our dug down corridor. So what's different between what you see in the historic range of the longleaf pine and the montane longleaf pine? Well, genetically, really, there's no difference. They're the same tree. But from an ecosystem standpoint, the longleaf pine is different for coastal pine and for montane longleaf pine. So the major differences are the understory, and most of that green area, you're going to have what's called a wiregrass ecosystem. It's a specific grass that's able to catch fire pretty easily. It carries fire really well, and it's the dominant grass found throughout most of the longleaf pine range. Well, in the mountain longleaf pine or the montane longleaf areas, we do not have the wiregrass. We have what's called a shrub oak understory, and we have other species that really help carry that fire through the ecosystem. And so the difference is really that understory. In the coastal longleaf, we've got the wiregrass. In the montane longleaf, we have a shrub oak understory. And with that comes a whole different suite of species, which I'll go over. Okay, so this map really focuses in on the dug down corridor and shows how it connects with the rest of the montane longleaf ecosystem. So if you're looking at that red outline, you look to the far right, you can see part of the dug down in northwest Georgia flowing into northeast Alabama. But then notice how you see this nice connection all the way down through Alabama. So what I think is incredibly unique about the dug down is not only can we connect, Georgia from Paulden Forest over to the Talladega, but we have a really nice forest continuing south all the way through Alabama. So it really is a multi-state, pretty large project. And I want to take just a few minutes to talk about the montane longleaf or coastal longleaf life cycle for those of you who aren't familiar. So if you think about pine trees in North Georgia, we have loblolly pine trees, we have Virginia pine trees, we have white pine trees, and then we have our montane longleaf pine trees. So what's the difference between all these trees? Well, if you saw a tree on the ground, any of these pine trees on the ground, I would say for the most part, it's going to be really difficult, a brand new seedling, to tell one from the other unless you really know what you're looking at. But once the longleaf pine actually really starts to come up and spread as a plug, if you're looking at the center picture there, that's what a longleaf pine tree would look like on the ground. So it almost looks like a little shrub. And this one is out of what I would call a plug stage. But if you look to the far right, that picture there shows a longleaf pine as it goes into the rocket stage. So the pine starts as this grass seedling. It turns into this rocket stage on the right. And then if you look to the far left, you'll see the older growth longleaf pine. And what I want to point out with the far left picture there is look how open the understory is. So what's unique about longleaf in general is longleaf is a fire dependent ecosystem. If we don't have fire, then our longleaf pine is not going to do well. So the Nature Conservancy plays a big role in prescribed fire with our longleaf pine all throughout the Southeast. All right, so let me tell you about some of the really neat species that are found specifically within the montane longleaf habitat. There's two federally listed species. In the far left corner, you'll see the northern long-eared bat. Unfortunately, it's been significantly affected by the white nose syndrome. So it was federally listed back in 2015. And we have found the northern long-eared bat right in Paulden and Sheffield Wildlife Management Area Forest. If you look to the far right, you can see the northern pine snake. It's a rare snake that's found in longleaf pine. We have found numerous of these snakes all through Paulden and Sheffield wildlife management areas. And it is really an indicator species for us to help track how the longleaf ecosystem is doing. And then if you move to the far left-hand corner there, you'll see the eastern fox squirrel. These are becoming less and less common, I would say, to see. I really only see them in old growth forest. And so we're actually seeing a return of the eastern fox squirrel in some of the areas that we've been working, the more we're bringing fire back into the ecosystem. And in the center picture there, you'll see the red-cockaded woodpecker. I wish I could say we had some incredible populations of that species in Northwest Georgia. Unfortunately, we do have old nest cavities, but we don't have large enough trees available for the red-cockaded woodpecker at this time in Georgia, but we do have a really nice population within the dug down corridor just over the state line in Alabama. And then on the far right, you can see Bachman's sparrow, which is a key species that we look at for migration and movement through the dug down corridor as well. So lots of numerous species that really depend on that longleaf pine habitat. All right, so what were the major causes of the loss of the longleaf pine ecosystem? So you remember back the map that we looked at that showed the coastal longleaf and the montane longleaf. Well, the vast majority of that longleaf is gone today. And my work area focuses specifically on the montane longleaf, but what I'm about to tell you really applies to all of longleaf pine. So I would say the biggest cause of the decline of the longleaf pine was fire suppression for the past 60, 70 years. So originally, when this is late kind of 1800s, early 1900s, we would have had lightning strikes that hit in our forest, and those lightning strikes would have burned hundreds of thousands of acres all over North Georgia. There would have been no roads to stop them, so the fire really would have carried well. And then once Native Americans were in the area, they actually used fire as a tool to keep the forest open. So they were regularly burning even after they had moved into North Georgia. Well, then in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we had settlers that really moved into North Georgia. They brought livestock. They unfortunately ate a good bit of the grass under the understory of our longleaf pine, and it led to the fire not being able to carry. And then in the early 1900s, you look at the photo we have here on our left, and you'll see Smokey the Bear, which was one of the most effective marketing campaigns ever in the United States. And it suppressed fires across the entire United States, including in Georgia. And so we saw no fires going through Georgia for decades and decades and decades. And what happened was hardwoods were able to come up where the longleaf pine was once the dominant tree because it's able to withstand fire. It's the natural tree in this area. When you don't have fire, the hardwood tree is able to come up and it gets over top of the longleaf pine trees, and then the longleaf pine ecosystem has slowly died out. So hardwood encroachment has been a major impact that's tied to that loss of fire. And in addition to the loss of fire, historically in this area, one of the other major losses, especially for North Georgia, is the replacement of most of the longleaf pine ecosystem with loblolly pine. So timber harvesting is huge in Georgia. My husband actually owns a timber business, and historically all of the loblollies have replaced the montane longleaf. So that's been a major loss. All right, so let's get to positive now. So what is the Nature Conservancy doing to bring back this longleaf pine ecosystem? So this slide, I want to just take a few minutes to talk about prescribed fire, which Eric mentioned. So prescribed fire is where the Nature Conservancy and our partners, our state partners, our federal partners, we are all working together to bring fire back to these forests that would have naturally burned. So in this specific dug down corridor, we've been working since about 2008 with our state partners. And in 2008, I would say there was no active burn program really happening. Well, since then, we've been able to burn about 2,000 to 4,000 acres a year, but our long-term goals are to burn 5,000 to 7,000 acres a year. So each year, we're really making significant strides forward in bringing prescribed fire back into this ecosystem. I would say back in 2008, we didn't see many of the eastern fox squirrel or some of our other native kind of indicator species. And same thing with our pine snake. And today we're seeing great numbers of pine snakes and the eastern fox squirrel. So I think the fire just in 1 decade has showed a significant progress toward restoring that actual ecosystem. So what else is the Nature Conservancy doing to bring back the montane longleaf? So the picture on the left shows a planting crew out planting longleaf plugs. You can see actually how large these plugs look when they're initially planted. And each year, the Nature Conservancy plants over 200,000 montane longleaf seedlings on both public and private land within the dug down corridor. The picture on the right shows that northern pine snake, which is the indicator species, again, for the montane longleaf. And it's been a really great species for the Nature Conservancy to focus on. We have a big collaborative project with Clemson University where we are tracking the pine snake. We're actually putting transponders in the snakes and tracking them through the forest. And we track them in both loblolly plantations as well as our longleaf forest. And that snake has actually been driving where we put prescribed fire, where we're harvesting timber, where we're coming back with longleaf or shortleaf or loblolly. So it's really been a key species for us in guiding our montane longleaf ecosystem restoration work. Okay, so that hits on some of the big terrestrial species, but as Eric mentioned, this area is really unique also for aquatics. So I wouldn't feel good if I didn't tell you a few minutes about some of the aquatics in the area. And I start with Raccoon Creek, which is one of the most successful projects that I would say the Nature Conservancy and partners have had in all of North Georgia. This is really how the Dug Down project actually began. So this started in the early 2000s as a protection project. If you look at the map on the right, you'll see the outline of the entire Raccoon Creek watershed. But what I want you to focus in on is the bright green areas. The bright green areas are permanently protected. That's state-owned land. And then the kind of green area beneath I would say the darker green area is Paulding Forest owned land. So that's actually county owned land that the Nature Conservancy and the state helps manage as well. But look at the amount of protected land within the Raccoon Creek watershed. The watershed itself is 35,000 acres, and we have easily well over half of that watershed permanently protected. So it's really been a phenomenal project that the Nature Conservancy and partners are really proud of. And the reason that it's unique is Raccoon Creek is the only biologically significant tributary downstream of Lake Allatoona. The species that you see there on the left are two of the indicator species that are found in Raccoon Creek. The top species is the federally endangered Etowah darter, and the bottom species is the federally threatened Cherokee darter. Both of these darters are small fish. They're very susceptible to sediment and they can really die pretty quickly if you have any type of water quality issues. But what's neat about both of these species are they're endemic to the Etowah watershed, which means they're found nowhere else in the world. And that's pretty common to see in a lot of our North Georgia streams. We have a lot of species where we have a lot of endemic species that you're not going to find anywhere else in the world. So it's incredible to say that we have that in our backyard right here in North Georgia. Okay, in addition to Raccoon Creek, remember I pointed out Tallapoosa being the southern anchor of the Dug Down corridor. So we're out sampling the Tallapoosa, trying to figure out what are the species of focus in the Tallapoosa. It's considered really an undersampled system, but it has fish that look very similar to ones we find in the Etowah. So if you look on the far right, the top picture shows the Tallapoosa darter, and the one just beneath it is the lipstick darter, which if you remember from the photo before, looks somewhat similar to our federally endangered Etowah darter. And then the photos on the left there are a soft shell turtle and a dragonfly. But we have incredible mussel biodiversity in our Tallapoosa River, and we're really excited about working more on land protection and restoration work in the Tallapoosa. And the last aquatic site that I'll leave you guys with is Terrapin Creek. So Terrapin Creek is a major tributary that flows into the Coosa River in Alabama, but Terrapin Creek actually starts in Georgia. So we have Northwest Georgia Terrapin Creek flowing into Alabama. It's known as a great recreational treasure in Alabama. There's tons of people that float Terrapin Creek, but it's also critical habitat for numerous mussel species. As Eric mentioned, the mussel biodiversity in Northwest Georgia is phenomenal. And the Tallapoosa and Terrapin Creek, and most of the Upper Coosa is well known for this mussel biodiversity. So, all right, I'll pass the baton to Anne.
All right, thank you, Katie. Can everyone hear me okay? I had to make a last minute change to thank you, Chelsea. All right, so Katie talked about why the dug down's important and the great restoration work we're doing there. So I just want to talk a bit about our protection effort to connect the Sheffield-Paulding WMA with the Talladega National Forest. So in approaching this protection effort, I think we really reflected on what's led us to be successful in tackling these landscape scale protection efforts in other parts of the state, places you may be familiar with, like the lower Altamaha, the Chattahoochee Fall Line, and the lower Satilla. And a few factors that really stand out here. One are the ownership patterns are favorable for this type of effort. We have strong and diverse partnerships that we're continuing to grow and build. And we are starting to put together some solid funding strategies that combine a variety of private and public funding sources to fund these acquisitions. So I'll talk a little bit about where things stand with ownership patterns and partnerships. And then when I talk through the status of specific acquisitions, that's where I'll address funding. So ownership. So this map just gives you a sense of what land ownership looks like in the dug down right now. The tracts highlighted in green are large tracts primarily owned by TIMOs and REITs. So these are large timberland tracts. And of all those lighter green tracts, those only have about 7 owners. So you can see we could make, in just a few transactions, some really significant headway towards connecting those 2 public anchors. So this opportunity to acquire these large undeveloped tracts in relatively few transactions is really key to success here. As land ownership becomes more fragmented, you have to do more transactions, it becomes more costly, more time consuming, and usually, more fragmented ownership means more development as well. So beyond those large tracts you see in the light green, there's some light gray tracts in there, and those are all tracts that are more than 100 acres, most of them much larger than 100 acres. So again, great opportunity to build those connections between the larger tracts. Partnerships. So we have multiple key partners in both Georgia and Alabama that are prioritizing this effort. Key current partners include the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, the Alabama chapter of the Nature Conservancy, the Conservation Fund, which is another conservation NGO working in both Georgia and Alabama. Local counties are supportive, community members, and we're also working to really deepen relationships with the Talladega National Forest and Alabama DNR. We've also had a number of philanthropic individuals and foundations that have expressed a lot of interest in this area. So now I'll just talk about where things stand in terms of land protection actions. So last year, the Conservation Fund purchased about 10,000 acres from Jamestown Properties and is holding these properties in the hopes that the Georgia Department of Natural Resources can purchase and permanently protect them in the future. And those are the tracts with the bold green outline on this map. And TNC is currently working to plant longleaf on these properties. Right now, TNC has an agreement to purchase the 2 tracts in red. Those we're calling the Jones Co. tracts. And so our plan is to purchase these properties, begin montane longleaf restoration. We'll make the properties available to the state to use as a publicly accessible wildlife management area, and we'll hold them until the state can take ownership from the Nature Conservancy. So right now, our ability to close on these Jones Co. tracts is contingent upon us receiving the grant funding we need to cover the purchase price. So we've put together a funding strategy that includes a mix of public and private dollars, with the estate bringing additional funding after we acquire the property to buy a conservation easement over the property. Two significant public grant funding sources we've applied to are the U.S. Forest Service Forest Legacy Program and the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Program. Forest Legacy is a program funded through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, it brings money down to the states that they can use to purchase easements and land. So the state has submitted a grant to purchase an easement over these properties. And then we have submitted a proposal to the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Program, which is Georgia's new dedicated source of state funding for land conservation. And if awarded, we'll use these funds to help with our purchase of the fee interest. As we wait for notification on these two major public grant funds, we continue to search and apply for additional funding sources. But really those two, Forest Legacy and Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Program, they are able to provide the largest amount of grant funding. So receiving those is really key to our success. But we think our proposals are very competitive, and hope to receive good news on those and close on the Jones Code tracts in fall of 2021. So as we continue to work on the Jones Code tracts, we're also talking to other large landowners in the corridor in the hopes that Jones Code is only the first of many protection actions to come. And in addition to fee acquisitions, we're also working on key elements of a conservation easement for this corridor, as that'll be a really important tool, as there are likely many landowners who are not interested in selling fee title to their land, but may be willing to sell or donate a conservation easement to help protect the corridor. So with any landscape scale effort, this is going to take considerable time and effort, but we're optimistic. We're really excited to be making headway here, excited that you're all here to learn more about this. I'll just touch quickly on some challenges that are unique to the dug down, interesting challenges that we'll have to tackle. One, if you're familiar with some of our other landscape scale projects, they're all located near a military installation, and the military is able to bring significant funding to these efforts through a program called REPI, which stands for Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration. This money is available to the military to help protect buffer lands around the installations. And that program has brought tens of millions of dollars to land protection in Georgia. There's no military installation near the dug down, so that just requires additional creativity on our part in identifying funding sources. Another challenge we've run into here is the mineral rights are fully severed on some of the lands in the dug down. On two of the key landowners' lands, the minerals are fully severed. So there's significant risk in acquiring lands with severed mineral rights. So we are trying to get creative and take a number of different approaches to remove that obstacle and move forward. So the dug down is one place where there's great opportunity for both land protection and restoration. But in the northeast part of the state, where a lot of the land is owned by the Forest Service, the land is protected, but there's still a lot of restoration work to do. So I'm going to hand it over to Tyler to talk to you about how we are approaching that work.
Hello, how's everyone doing tonight? Switch to straight content. There we go. Okay, so my name is Tyler Cross. I work up in the northeastern portion of the state. I'm the conservation coordinator up here. My job is primarily to rendezvous with partners we have up here. As was previously mentioned, the land's already protected, which is awesome, but there's a lot of work to be done. The Nature Conservancy up in this portion of the northern half of the state really puts a big priority on getting that work done, making that everyone can hit their own stewardship goals. So in order so we have time for questions at the end, I'm going to move forward rather quickly. So if we can just go to the next slide. Yeah, all right. So this is sort of a reiteration of what Eric and everyone else has already said. The biodiversity of this corridor in the Southern Blue Ridge is absolutely amazing, and we want to focus heavily on that. So that previous slide showed a big chunk of what I'm talking about. My project area, the project area of this northern section, is basically the Chattahoochee National Forest and then a buffer around that. This lines up more or less, you can see, with that northern section of Georgia where the Southern Blue Ridge ecosystem intersects with the Georgia state line. Go right ahead now, next. The biggest partner we have up here is, unsurprisingly, because they own the most land, the Chattahoochee National Forest. And up in this portion of the state, our big priority is getting fire on the ground. We do that mostly by providing a fire crew. And while that fire crew does a lot of other tasks, their primary concern is helping the Chattahoochee National Forest put fire on the ground. That means we help prep, that means we help burn, and that means we do all other portions of the prescribed fire process. You can go right up on to the next one. All right, fire pictures. Everyone likes fire pictures. Fire in the northern portion of the state is a lot different than the southern part of the state. However, it is still absolutely critical to the maintenance of the habitats that exist. That is true for a variety of reasons. One, as has previously been mentioned, this portion of the country, along with many parts of the country, was fire suppressed for a really long time. During the period that it was fire suppressed, a set of environmental factors that were not true for most of the evolutionary history of this portion of the world were present. The absence of fire allowed certain trees to proliferate and allowed them to suppress other tree species. Not only tree species, but everything from the very top of the canopy all the way down to subsoil interactions are impacted by the lack of fire. By reintroducing fire to an ecosystem, we can sort of jumpstart those old natural products. True, in the short term, we're eliminating a bunch of species, but we're giving room for the more natural ecosystem to reassert itself, which is not to say fire is the only arrow in that particular quiver, but it is a really efficient arrow, and we've had an easy time getting a bunch of it done. Go into the next one. All right, here's a fantastic example of what fire actually can do. This looks a little dire to you, but the image on the left side here, you have an area that has not been exposed to fire. You can see that basically no light is hitting the soil whatsoever. Everything is choked up. There's very little room for tree regeneration, pine regeneration, any sort of new species addition to the area. On the right, yes, it's been burned. You don't see there's a comparatively small amount of litter. That's really helpful for oaks and pine species, both of which need a direct soil contact from their seeds in order to thrive. It also means there's less competition, more light is hitting the soil, more light basically improves germination success. And of course, weaker or older trees that are diseased or infected with rot or just not competitive are being slowly culled from the environment. That is, again, part of the natural cycle and what we are attempting to encourage. So just moving right along. All right, more than just helping with fire, as was mentioned previously, we are trying to work with our partners in this region on other stewardship projects. That means we're helping plant trees. That means we're helping with timber stand improvement. We're opening up bogs that are beginning to get overcrowded. We're helping treat invasive species. Fire, like I said, is a really amazing tool. However, it would be silly to limit ourselves to only using fire when there are other tools available. And like I said, while the crew up in North Georgia, or at least in Northeast Georgia, is primarily a fire crew, we do other things as well. So let's keep on going. All right. Other partners that we have include Restoring America's Forests, the Bog Learning Network, Consortium for Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, and the Save Georgia Hemlocks League. Everyone, or there's rather a lot of people involved with this effort up north. It's hard to overstate just that we are only one part of this whole process. Obviously, the National Forest Service is a fantastic partner to be involved with. They provide access to a tremendous amount of different lands that we can help monitor and fix. But one more slide, I think. But obviously, they aren't the only people involved. You can see down in the corner there, I went with charismatic pictures. That is the residue of an insect called the woolly adelgid, which is impacting hemlocks in the area. You can see, again, more fire. And just in general, the proliferation of tree species that are more emblematic of this portion of the country. Right, like I said, I'd kind of raced through it. Well, other things I would love to talk about, but in short, the National Forest Service has already done a great job at protecting lands up in North Georgia. We are doing our very best to mean so that their protection of the lands can be treated with or combined with fantastic stewardship. And there we go. Enough time for questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Tyler. We really appreciate you moving quickly through that, and sorry that you did have to do that. But I think on our last slide, and everyone's the presenter's contact information is available for follow-up if you have additional questions that you wanted covered. We have a few minutes here, so thanks for the questions that have come in through the chat. We will try to get through those. Excuse me. And we will also invite you to type in the letter R to the chat if you would like to come off mute and ask your question directly. I think our first question is going to come from Nancy Claire to kick us off.
Yes, thank you so much. Can y'all hear me, Chelsea? Yes, okay. I have 1,000 questions and I put some in the chat. So I just have a big picture question. Carbon sequestration, people are saying, don't burn. How does fire affect carbon, the climate change issue? Does biodiversity outweigh the fire burning as far as carbon capturing and emitting?
Hey, Nancy, I'll take that question. That's a great question and one that we get a lot. And it's a pretty complicated answer and pretty nuanced, given the wide variation of fire effects across the country. So really just kind of boiling it down to the effects in Georgia and looking at where fire is a natural part of the process. And what we see in Georgia tends to be low to moderate fire effects, fire severity and intensity. And our research has shown that two things. Kind of one, most of the carbon that results from these low intensity burns is actual soot that goes right back into the soil almost as a fertilizer. And then secondly, we see a larger reflush of regrowth after a fire that actually sucks up more carbon than what was released during the fire. So if you think about mowing your grass, kind of a silly analogy, but if the grass gets tall enough, it starts kind of getting brown and dying and not really growing. If you mow it, it starts growing again, flush up really green. Prescribed fire does the same way. And when it starts flushing back green, it's taking in more carbon than what was released as carbon dioxide. That is not necessarily the case for some of these high intensity fires that we see in the media, where it's just stand replacement fires like out in California, or there's some pretty dire research going on in peat bogs in the Arctic. So I won't talk about that too much.
Thank you, Eric. I'm going to jump over to the question that Alex posted into the chat, saying there's a lot of linear infrastructure crisscrossing the dug down corridor. Are we talking with the Georgia Department of Transportation, Georgia Power, Georgia Transmission Corp, and pipeline owners about maintaining or reestablishing both aquatic and terrestrial connectivity between natural habitats fragmented by the vast infrastructure network? Eric, maybe that's a you question or an Ann question?
Chelsea, I'll take it. Okay. So I put a little bit in the chat, but basically that's a great question. And yes, there's Plant Bowen that's located on the eastern edge of that dug down corridor. And so Georgia Power has literally transmission lines, 500 kilovolt lines, along with all their smaller 115 lines running all over the place through the dug down corridor. And yes, we are working with Georgia Power. I would actually say part of the Raccoon Creek project started as somewhat of a collaboration with Georgia Power, trying to figure out how can we limit their impacts on Raccoon Creek and the larger montane longleaf ecosystem. So really, they're a major partner of ours, especially in the Raccoon Creek and Paul Den Forest, Sheffield wildlife management areas. So we work with them on both aquatics and specifically on the pine snake, tracking its movement and whatnot. I would say I feel like we have a lot more work to do, right? We've done really well in that eastern anchor of the dug down. But you're right, there's gas pipelines and other things that are heavily influencing land management and whatnot all throughout the dug down corridor. So we do have those folks kind of highlighted as a target that we need to work with. And like I said, we've done really well on the eastern side, and we're trying to take that success westward now.
Wonderful, thank you. And I appreciate everyone answering some of the questions in the chat as well as we've gone. So I'm going to pull in a question that came in advance, actually, from Scott. What percentage of Georgia forests would you guess have active and effective fire programs?
I'll take that one too. So we know through data that is gathered by the Georgia Forestry Commission, who permits fire, that about 1 million acres of Georgia is burned every year. So I think Georgia is roughly 8 to 9 million acres. So you might be looking at about 10% of Georgia is actually burned. And most of that's going to be heavily concentrated in South Georgia. And even more so, it's going to be heavily concentrated in Southwest Georgia with areas that are being managed for quail plantations. So in North Georgia, it's a lot smaller. So our biggest, the biggest person who's doing most burning in North Georgia is going to be the Georgia Department of Natural Resources and the U.S. Forest Service. And out of a 700,000 acre forest on the Chattahoochee National Forest, they're doing really well if they burn 20,000 acres a year. It's usually more along the lines of about 10,000 acres out of 700,000. So it's pretty small in North Georgia.
Thank you. We are down to our final 2 minutes, so I'm going to do a question that I'm hoping each panelist will answer maybe in the order that you presented. So we'll go Eric, Ann, Katie, and Tyler. What is your favorite species from North Georgia that symbolizes the extraordinary biodiversity of North Georgia?
Well, of course, I'm going to have to go first. I would have to say the Table Mountain pine, which we didn't talk about much today, but that's kind of the Northeast version of a longleaf pine. That pine actually has a pine cone that is serotinous. It's held together by pine sap that does not open until it's affected by some sort of heat, usually fire. Once it actually gets heat, it opens up and drops its seed.
Ann?
Yeah, well, you are asking a question of a non-scientist that does the bidding of scientists like Eric and Katie. But the various darter species are obviously so key to our freshwater systems in this area. So I don't know that I'll call out one, but name those in particular.
All right, and I think I would have to follow up on Ann. So really for me, one of the species that's tied to some of our biggest successes historically here in Northwest Georgia has been the Etowah darter, which is that endemic species. Remember, that's only found in the Etowah watershed. It's got it's bright blue, bright reds during spawning seasons. It's an incredible fish to see in person, and one that I hope stays around for a long time.
All right, and then I guess I'm gonna weirdly go follow up with Eric. So a little note on me. I'm not from Georgia at all. This is as far south as I have ever lived in my entire life. Your summers are an experience, but I'm from very, very far up in the Northeast, and my favorite tree up there is actually the Eastern hemlock, and I was absolutely stoked to find out that it also exists down here. The Eastern hemlock is, if not an ecosystem engineer, it has massive impacts on forests where it exists. It changes soil chemistry, it changes soil moisture. The boughs of it create a radically different environment for plants and animals to grow in than exists right next to it. And we are at the very, very southern edge of its range. And it's just absolutely awesome to me that it exists here. It's a really special tree. It's a tree that climate change is absolutely threatening in Georgia. Like I said, we're at the very southern portion of its range. There's nowhere for it to go. I absolutely love hemlocks. They're great. They're highly threatened by woolly adelgid, and I'm psyched that I get to see them fairly regularly now.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for all of this wonderful content that you presented tonight. Thank you to our attendees, and thank you to Nancy Claire for hosting this for us. Any parting thoughts from you that you'd like to share?
Yes, I want to thank everyone for taking an hour out of their day to listen and to learn. I want to say that I listened to Jennifer Morris, the new CEO of TNC, and she talked about this is the most important decade. This is 2020. We have 10 more years if we're going to make a difference on climate change. So if you are so moved to help support this work financially or other ways, please reach out. Please reach out to Stacy, and they'll send more information in a follow-up email. Thank you.